Me too.
Okay, so it is 5:33. I'd like to call to order the joint Concord-Carlisle School Committee, Concord School Committee workshop with members of the Concord Finance Committee and members of the Carlisle Finance Committee as visitors to order. Court, would you like to call Concord to order?
Yes, thank you. And the Concord School Committee is called to order, and we believe that our FinComs are not in formal session, so there wouldn't be a roll call necessary there. If we are mistaken, correct us.
That is correct.
Okay. So with that, we can do a roll call attendance for school committee.
Anderson, present.
Booth, present.
Out, present.
Rainey, present.
And I see,
Mustafi, present.
good.
Wilson, present.
Okay.
Okay, great. And so I'd like to just welcome everybody here for the night. I'd like to just remind everybody that everybody who has been invited to come this evening, so the committee members are asked to please keep your cameras on, and any other members of the public who are in attendance, please turn off your cameras so that it's easier to keep track of who is participating in this workshop. And I will note that the meeting is being recorded. We're here tonight to prepare ourselves for the budget season ahead. And in these unprecedented times, it's worth taking a moment to check in with one another to ensure that we're speaking a common language and sharing common goals, expectations through the budget process. With that, I think, in court, unless you have something to add,
No. I think that's exactly our purpose tonight. And thank you, Sarah, for framing it that way.
with that, I think it'd be great if we could take a moment to get to know each other, to introduce ourselves. And I'd like to ask the Concord FinCom members to please introduce yourselves, and then the Carlisle FinCom members.
Mary, do you want to coordinate that?
Sure, I'll start. I'm Mary Hartman. I'm the chair of the Finance Committee. I want to start by thanking you for having this session. I really think it's a testimony to the fact that the schools want to be transparent with how they make their budget, and I really appreciate that. I'll turn it over now to the vice chair, our guideline chair. Chris, you want to introduce yourself?
Yep. So I'm Chris Reynolds. Mary said I'm the vice chair, and this year I'll be running the guidelines process. So I'm looking forward to another interesting process and working with you guys on the budgets.
Great, thank you. Next, I think Dee, you want to introduce yourself since you're the observer to the school?
Sure, yeah. Dee Ortner. This is my second year on the Finance Committee, and this year I'm the observer to the school committee or school committees.
The other person I see, Dean, you want to introduce yourself? We all know you, Dean.
Thank you. Dean Banfield, I'm the former chair. Mary, thank you for taking that role on. I just stepped down. It's my fourth year on the committee, and I'm looking forward to the meeting.
The other people I see, Greg, you're muted. Good.
Greg Guariello. My name should be unknown to the school committee, hopefully. Everybody knows. I will state it here. Dawn Guariello is my wife, and she's the co-chair of the middle school building committee.
Thanks, Greg. John Hickling, you want to?
Good evening, everyone. My name's John Hickling. This is my third year on the Finance Committee, and thank you for doing this. This is going to be terrific. I may have to leave early, but I will watch it on YouTube, the parts I miss.
Right.
Kathy, you want to say something? Kathy, do you want to say something? Good. Hi.
Hi, excuse me. Not at this time.
Okay. And then last but not least, Ray is a new member. He's not been sworn in, but he's a hybrid member tonight. So Ray, you want to just say hi?
Yeah. Yes, I am both last and least tonight. Don't let Mary mislead you. As she just explained why. I live in.
Angela's here.
Andrea's on too.
Andrea's here.
There you go. Andrea.
Hi,
Hi.
Andrea Zoll. My fourth year on the Finance Committee meeting. Hope to be able to make it through this whole workshop.
Great. Thanks. That's it. That's it for us.
Excellent, thank you.
Welcome, everybody.
So shall we turn to Carlisle?
Jim, Melissa?
I'll go first. It's a much shorter list. I'm Jim Darr. I'm the chair of the Carlisle Finance Committee, and I've been on the committee now, chair for a short time period, but I've been on the committee for 8 years.
And I'm Melissa McMorrow. I'm on the Finance Committee. I think it's my third year, and I'm the school committee liaison. And it's good to see some familiar faces because when I was on the regional school committee, I served with some of you on a budget subcommittee. So good to see your faces again.
Great. Thank you, everybody. Mary, Christine, Dee, Dean, Craig, John, Kathy, Ray, Andrea, Jim, and Melissa. It's wonderful that we are all able to make it tonight. Let's quickly introduce the school committee members. We'll do the usual, the alphabetical order, I think.
Hi, everyone. I'm Alexa Anderson, and this is my very first year on the school committee. So this is my first budget workshop. Nice to meet you.
Good evening, I'm Court Booth. I'm serving as the Concord chair for the current year.
Hi, everyone. Heather Bout. Mostly familiar faces here. It's my 6th year on the school committee. But it may also be my first budget workshop like this because I don't think we've actually ever done it like this before. So it's really good to see you all here. Thanks.
Good evening, everybody. Fatima Mezdad, also my first year on the school committee, and I'm looking forward to the workshop and grateful that you could all join us this evening. Thank you.
Good evening. This is Eva Mustafi. I'm a Carlisle Regional School Committee member. This is my second workshop. Welcome. It's very nice to meet everyone and put the faces to the names that we hear of during some of the presentations. And I look forward to learning a lot today. So thank you for taking your time out of your busy day.
Cynthia Rady, it's my second year on the Concord and Concord-Carlisle school committees, and I look forward to having this discussion with everybody tonight. Thank you.
And Sarah Wilson, I am the chair of the regional school committee, and I am coming to you from Carlisle. So this is great. Thanks. So Jared, I think everyone has received Jared's presentation. So you should have it handy. You may have noticed that there's a glossary of terms at the end, but if any terminology arises in this workshop that Jared has not covered, it would be great to make a note of it and hopefully can incorporate it on so that this can be a kind of a living document that we can refer to, not just during this budget process, but through budget processes to come.
No, I'm not sure if FinCom got a copy of the slides, but they certainly can at the conclusion.
Okay.
I sent them out to the Concord FinCom.
You did. Good. Okay. Thank you. Okay. Jared, before you get started, although your superintendent needs no introduction, perhaps you could introduce Lori, and again, who certainly needs no introduction, and your colleague Ian, please.
Sure. Lori?
We got it, Jared. Yeah. Thank you all. We're glad to have you. I'm actually looking forward to tonight. And we've never really talked process without a lot of numbers in front of us. So I think this is going to be a great opportunity.
And I'd like to introduce Ian Rames, the Assistant Business Manager. He's the brains behind a lot of this stuff.
It goes right.
Yes. And for those of you that don't know me, I'm Jared Stanton, the Director of Finance and Operations. I've been here 32 years, it feels like. I am,
And that's just for this year, right?
That's this year.
so I am now in my third year, loving every minute of it.
Great. So this evening, we're going to start with Jared's presentation that everybody now should have. I just sent it to Melissa and Jim. And there's a lot to take on. So if it's agreeable to everyone, I think it'd be helpful if we sort of take a pause after each slide, check in and see if there is a question or two about what we've just discussed. Tonight is not about specifics or getting into the weeds. And so questions should be really about clarifying what Jared has just presented. And as the two FinComs are here as visitors, this is not a time for deliberating between the committees. Jared, is it fair to say that afterwards you're available by email or something to sort of go into a deeper dive should anybody feel that they seek more clarity?
Absolutely. Yep.
Yep. And I know that you also have in your presentation lots of very helpful links that go much deeper into every element that we're going to be discussing. So does that sound okay to everybody?
Good.
Great.
All right. And Sarah, with your permission, I'll be a person who notes the time periodically. I'll give us a 6 o'clock and a 6:30 check-in so that we really try to conclude by our 7:30 predicted time.
Okay.
Thank you.
Perfect. So I think with that, Jared, please.
All right.
Lead us away.
Let's see.
Unknown caller.
Can you all see the screen?
Yes.
Yes. Yeah.
Perfect. Excellent. So Zoom is a little difficult to present on, so I can't really see faces. So if you have a question or something, just speak up. So I'm going to be covering quite a bit of topics at a very high level tonight. I've added links throughout the presentation, as Sarah just mentioned. I will say if you're having any trouble sleeping tonight, you can put the melatonin away and you could go into a deep dive on municipal finance law. There's a lot in this presentation. But ultimately, my hope is that this can be a mini school finance manual for many of you new and old members. Items included in this presentation are budgeting and reporting structures we must adhere to. Next is going to be a summary of the 5 type of funds that we use. I'll take you through our zero-based budget process. Per our regional agreement, we use the alternative method, but it's important for everyone to understand the statutory method. If we're ever in a state again that the commissioner takes over our budget, he uses the statutory method for assessments, like he did with the 1/12 budget. Our enrollment has increased in Concord over the past few years, and that trend will continue. It's important to understand the financial impact of that before the guidelines are finalized. In addition to local aid, we receive state and federal aid. On this slide, I'll show you where to find the resources and the latest projections. All regions must have a regional agreement, and there are items that need to be in every regional agreement, and I'll just go over that with you all. All districts have excess and deficiency or E&D accounts. Towns have the equivalent of free cash. Other post-employments or OPEB that refers to benefits other than pensions that a state or local government employee receives as part of his or her package of retirements. And I'll go into a little bit on OPEB. I linked a number of Mass General laws and information under municipal finance laws, and there'll be a number of links on that slide. I included 2 appendices. I use a number of financial terms throughout the year that people may or may not be familiar with, especially if they are new. Appendix A has about 35 to 40 basic definitions, and I'm going to continue to update those. In Appendix B, I link a guide to financial management for town officials. This document provides a resource for local officials that will help them gain a general understanding of local government finances. It breaks down the roles of the Finance Committee, the Select Board, Superintendent, and the School Committee, and the role that they play, again, in the finances. Lastly, I linked the Massachusetts Regional Administrators Guidebook. This manual exhausts the many rules, regulations, and legal requirements imposed on regional districts. So as a municipality, we are held to strict accounting standards, and we are audited yearly. We will be bringing the results of our FY20 audit sometime in January. But if you're interested in learning more about the Uniform Mass Accounting System, it's here and it's hyperlinked. Every Massachusetts school district is required within 9 months of the close of its fiscal year to arrange for and undergo an independent audit of its financial records, and then submit the report to the Department of Elementary and Secondary Education, which is also known as DESE. Hyperlinked are the school district's agreed upon procedures. Most districts only have to do 1 end-of-year report. Ian gets to do 2. I help him a little bit, but Ian gets to do 2. These reports are due September 30th of each fiscal year. The end-of-year report must be consistent with the department regulations and guidelines, and they consist of 6 different schedules. Number 1 is revenue and expenditure. Number 2 is assessments. 3 is instructional services by school. 4 is special education expenditures by placement. 5 is the transportation reimbursement piece. And lastly is the annual school budget. These reports must be reported using DESE's chart of accounts. There are 9 DESE function categories that I often refer to as the DESE 1000 functions in my monthly variance reports. Under each of these, there are subcategories, which I often refer to as the 100 functions. In addition, there are object codes under each subcategory. While DESE functions are often changing, we can't realistically keep up, but we do update our crosswalk every single year to make sure that we're reporting the right information in our end-of-year report. Every spring, we publish budget books, and you can find them either by this link or on our website. In addition, this year, we started posting our monthly financial reports, and those will be updated tomorrow. Lastly, the district pays a subscription to Cleargov. Cleargov breaks down the information districts submit in their DESE end-of-year report, as well as other data submissions, and analyzes them and does pretty graphs, and it's pretty informative. Everyone who is I believe everyone who lives in the 2 towns should have access to these 2 sites. And I'll make sure everyone on this call tonight has their own username and password. And the data is from 2015 forward. Any questions on this information?
Jared, can I ask a quick question?
Please.
How do you use Cleargov? What do you find useful? Are there particular functions or areas that you find helpful for various purposes?
Yeah, I use it when I'm trying to compare ourselves to other districts, such as our DART districts, which you have on DESE. But if I want to go outside that and get more information on enrollment, on teacher salaries, on how much they're spending in each function, it's a great tool. They do have, like I said, really nice graphs that I have used in my past budget presentations. So that's what I use it for, but I also rely on my own numbers as well. So I find myself sometimes comparing what I have to what they have, and they're pretty spot on. and you have to understand the numbers that are in our system are that I present oftentimes get changed when we do not an incredible change, but once we use our crosswalk and submit that data to DESI. So sometimes I just want to make sure I'm in the same ballpark, which we always are, with what our system says for a previous year compared to what they're reporting. Ian, do you find Cleargov, do you go on that much? Anything you can add?
Sorry. So I've used it. It's really user friendly. It's really fast to find and compare ourselves with other districts really quickly. But if you wanted to dive into it, the state actually has, I think, more informative reports available. They have the per pupil expenditure report, which kind of breaks down costs on a per pupil basis between all the districts. And I think that is probably the most useful piece of information you can use.
Jared, I'd like to add that there is a not modest cost. There is a fee attached such that if we do get people in the two towns using it for the purposes you described, that'd be well and good. That's the way I've used it, is mostly for comparative analysis as well. Just pause for a minute. Crosswalk means if you have an expense coded one way and DESI has it coded another way, you walk it over to their classification system for end of year reporting. Is that correct?
Correct. So when I report our quarterly variance report, I have asterisks next to DESI functions that are no longer DESI functions, such as, say, a 2300. 2300 is no longer a DESI, what I call 100 function. It's now 2305 classroom teachers. So Ian updates his crosswalk every single year to make sure that the functions, because we can't possibly change our account structure every year, we would lose history. And as long as you have a tight crosswalk, that's fine. So we have about 7 or 8 functions right now that are outdated, but they're very close to, you wouldn't have a 100 or a 1000 function have the crosswalk of something in a 2000 function. It's always within the same 100 function.
Within the same high level category.
Correct.
Yeah. All right. Thank you.
Sure.
Thank you for that answer.
Sure. Great. Thanks, John. So we have 5 types of accounts, or I'm sorry, 5 types of funds. Our largest is the general fund, and revenue comes from state and local aid, from taxes and local aid. Both districts receive federal and state grants, as well as private gift and donation grants. At CPS, we receive about $1.4 million in federal grants. We receive $550,000 in state MECO grants, and we anticipate to get about $600,000 in special ed circuit breaker, which I will explain in a later slide. At the region, we receive about $750,000 in federal grants, $389,000 in MECO, and we're expecting to receive about $801,000 at this time in circuit breaker. Next, the revolving accounts, and some of the larger ones include athletics and food service. Balances carry forward from year to year, but they cannot run in the red. And lastly, we have capital funds and trust funds. And I'll go more into funds on later slides as well. So in a typical year, the zero-based budget process starts in September and technically can go all the way to town meeting. September is quite early, but due to the Concord Town Charter, the town manager must submit to the select board not less than 90 days before annual town meeting an estimate of expenditures for the ensuing fiscal year. Town meeting is normally in early April. So if you do the math, the school committee target to vote the school budgets are before the winter break, because if they don't, they'll only have a week or less before the town manager's deadline nears. Therefore, we need to do the superintendent's recommended budget and have it presented to the school committee in mid-November. This means we have 2.5 months to build a budget for the following year, which when it is submitted is still 7.5 months away. Therefore, it's often outdated once the new fiscal year opens up. The zero-based budget process includes zero-basing every line item, including all staffing, all supplies, materials, equipment, leases, hardware, and softwares. This includes teaching softwares, which has grown exponentially during the pandemic. For every non-salary item, we ask for a brief description or reason why the items are needed, and a brief description of the impact or consequence of not having the item requested. Budget packets are sent out to all principals and departments and include 5 years of budget versus actuals for every single line. Staffing sheets, which include the backup that are made up for the current fiscal budget, and full-time equivalents, also referred to as FTEs, which are now often outdated at this point, and the most current fiscal FTEs and projected actuals. We also give them the zero-based backup for every non-salary line item if asked, as well as the backup of what was spent in those line items from the prior fiscal year. And then a new zero-based form and instructions. On October 1st of each year, we send the principals their enrollment numbers, and this impacts the staffing for the next budget. Also, regional assessments, as you know, are based on these enrollment figures. And again, I'll speak about that in a later slide. We work with the maintenance manager and the principals to try to identify any capital items that we may need. We update the 5-year capital plan every year, and we adjust it to keep within the town manager's allocation, which right now is approximately $900,000. The definition of capital item is something that is over $25,000 to $50,000 and has a shelf life of over 5 years. Every year we have lists that we go over with each principal. Items we identify include painting needs, both interior and exterior, flooring and stairwell needs, security, carpeting needs, furniture needs, lawnmowers, snow blowers, plows, roofs, rooftop units, boilers, AC chillers, HVAC systems, windows, ceiling tiles, lighting, walkways, fields, vehicles, and buses, and more. And then linked below is the most recent capital plan. Any questions? And I talk a lot more about the zero-based budget process too when I roll out the budget. So if you have any questions, I'll be sure to answer them then too.
I do have a question. Jared, this is Mary. I have a quick question. You mentioned buses when you were talking about your capital. Do you lease most of your buses now, so they would be in the operating? Okay.
Correct. They are all in the operating. It is something that, it is a conversation, but right now we have it. We have a 10-year plan. It's in the general fund budget. It's funded, and I don't anticipate asking for that to be in capital.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah.
Can I follow up on that one?
Please.
Yeah. Has this transitioned over time from before your arrival, Jared, from us buying a bus or two once every few years to us now leasing as we go forward? Has that transitioned to a different process than previous? Because my recollection, this is going back several years, I think, is that we were attempting to, replace buses with a purchase when
Correct.
We did it. But is that true?
And Ian can jump in too. There were, I want to say, a few years before I arrived, there was a big capital purchase of buses. So
you want me to speak to that? Because I was involved.
And I'll follow up with why I disagree.
Thanks, I appreciate this.
Yeah, when as soon as the high school building project was wrapping up, the buses were basically, we had been deferring replacing buses up till that point, just because we didn't know the status of the transportation facilities at that point. So as soon as the high school building project was done, And as soon as we had Knox Trail in place, there was a huge push there was buses purchased outright. There were buses that were financed, and they were financed a couple different ways. So there was a big push to get a lot of buses replaced really quickly. Now we're kind of transitioning to a more stable, a couple buses a year type of model. So,
yeah. Which I am very comfortable with and recommend keeping that. Ian has done a great job. I inherited it of them starting this process of getting everything in the general fund budget that we're able to do 2 or 3 buses a year per district without the budget number going up exponentially, if at all.
But those are we're leasing, not actually acquiring them. I mean, not buying them.
Yeah.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah, they're lease purchases, so it's more akin to, you know, financing the purchase of a car. So even though they're called a lease, it's a lease purchase, so we own it at the end.
Thanks.
Great. So regional assessments, another fun part. There are 2 legal ways to calculate assessments. Based on the regional agreement, we use an alternative method. But it's important to understand the difference between the 2 because the Commissioner of Education uses the statutory method when calculating either our budget or a 1/12th assessment like he did this past summer. When using the statutory method, each such assessment shall be the sum of the following amounts: the member's required local contribution to the regional school district as determined by the Commissioner, the member's share of that portion of the regional school district's net school spending that exceeds the total required local contribution for all members. This share to be allocated pursuant to the assessment provisions of the regional agreement, and the member's share of costs for transportation, capital project debt service, and other capital costs, and all other expenditures not included in the regional school district's net school spending. This share to be allocated pursuant to the assessment provisions of the regional agreement. On the other hand, the alternative assessment method works as such that assessments shall be the sum of the following amounts: the member's share of the regional school district's net school spending, the member's share of the cost for transportation, capital project debt service, other capital costs, and all other expenditures not included in the regional school district's net school spending. Both such shares to be allocated pursuant to the assessment provisions of the regional agreement. So that was pretty hard to follow, I'm sure, without examples. So what I was able to do is do the FY20 budget assessment using both formulas. And this should answer probably some of your questions here. So the first one is what we do use. We use the alternative method. The first box starts with your net school spending. So that budget number is actually our net school spending number. The definition of net school spending is your budget minus transportation and debt. So from there, you subtract other revenues such as Chapter 70 aid, any E&D contributions, which are used to offset assessments, miscellaneous revenue, rental, interest, and charter reimbursements. So from there, you see that we have $27.2 million that gets assessed to the 2 towns based on the October 1 enrollment, which you can see at the top of the page was 76.1 to 23.90. And that was based on the October enrollment of October 2019. The next box is our transportation assessment. Our total budgeted transportation costs are just over $744,000, but it's offset by the Chapter 71 regional transportation. Regional school districts must provide transportation to all students who live outside 1.5 miles from their school. While regional schools were promised that eligible transportation costs would be 100% funded by the state, it's really closer to 75 to 80% of total costs. Therefore, the amount above the reimbursement is assessed according to the enrollment formula. The next box is debt. Debt is also assessed based on the enrollment formula. And then the next two boxes are the summary of the total assessments with debt and without debt. So I'm going to compare this one, the alternative method, to what the statutory method and the difference between the two. So as you can see at the top, the same budget or net school spending and Chapter 70 numbers in both methods are the same. But now the difference is the minimum local requirement as published by DESE is automatically assessed, and then any amount above that is then assessed based on the enrollment. So the transportation and debt boxes are the same, but the assessments shifted a little. You can see down at the bottom, surprisingly, using the statutory method, there was only a $20,000 difference. Using the statutory method, Carlisle shifted up about $20,000. So it's also important to note that the minimum local requirement or contribution, it's MLR or MLC, depending on who's talking. If there's a big swing or a correction one year, that can significantly change assessments. So for example, if Carlisle's minimum local requirement went up 250,000, which would be an extreme, but you never know if they're doing some sort of correction, their assessment will go up more than 190,000 based on the formula, and Concord's would then go down. So any questions on the difference between the two?
Do we assume that the alternative method was consciously intended to avoid those kind of swings, or do we not know the thinking at the time?
Yeah, you know what? I don't know. That is districts that are right at the minimum local contribution. These numbers, the minimum local requirement, every year you're holding your breath to make sure that these numbers don't swing. So in a district such as Concord that really puts a lot of money towards education, and the amount that we are above the Chapter 70 in the minimum local contribution of 14 million, it doesn't make a huge difference between the statutory and the alternative method. That might not have answered your question, but it's just because we are so far above it that that might have been the thinking.
But it renders the threat, as it were, rather minimal.
Correct.
Okay.
Court, I think ours is the original formula in the original regional agreement. The statutory pieces, didn't most of those come in later, Jared? So I think it's just a fact that we are sticking with what the regional agreement started with.
Yep.
And Jared's right. The reason it doesn't change it very much is because both communities spend so far above net school spending.
Yeah.
In other communities, the statutory forced each municipality to pay a certain minimum. And, we're grateful that is not an issue here at all. So.
Good, thank you.
I've seen in districts that the minimum local contribution has gone up more than 1 or 2%, that just because of that, it puts that district in an override territory.
Yeah.
My previous district, Groton and Dunstable, it happened 2 out of my 3 years.
On a slightly different note, could you just give us a quick status on the discussion that Dan Conti in 2018, when he was leaving his role as chair, recommended, which is that we revisit the regional agreement? Has there been any motion on that in the last few years?
Lauren, you want to answer?
The main reason that Dan recommended that was because of the rather stark changes that occur as individual towns change their percentages annually, rather than having it be smooth, on a 3-year average or a 5-year average or something like that. That was the main sticking point that Dan wanted to leave us thinking about.
Yeah, I think Laurie will speak to it. I think, Dean, it was triggered by a $500,000 swing in a single year.
to Concord, right?
Yeah.
Right.
Lori, do you want to speak to that?
Sure, I will. A year and a half, and then mostly last fall of 2019, we did at the committee level have a discussion about what would be the level of interest in looking at the regional agreement. We even had Mars, the Regional School Committee Association, come out and do a presentation. That would have been the spring of 2019, Jared.
Yep.
And last fall, I think the committee was quite clear that that wasn't of interest to tackle a reopening of the agreement. It's a massive project. And there seemed to be at the time, I don't intend to bring it back, given that I haven't had any feedback from this current committee that it was a priority. At the time, it seemed that both members, Concord and Carlisle school committee membership, felt it was working as is. We're getting better at seeing the enrollments as they're coming. Doesn't mean they level out, Dean, but we at least are predicting and budgeting for them with less urgency than we had been. So that's where I see it standing. I haven't heard this current committee, and you can all speak for yourselves, obviously. I haven't heard that come up, nor would I think Jared and I see it as a top priority this school year.
Thanks. That's a brief update. That's really all I'm looking for, because I don't want to derail this conversation.
Yep.
So
no, it's a good question. It had been on the radar and I think vetted and put back to bed again.
But it is dormant. It is. We haven't forgotten, Dean.
Mm-hmm.
You know, if it becomes irrelevant or more acute, we're going to certainly revisit it quickly. And although I say revisit it quickly, it would not be a quick process if we undertake it.
The real problem, I think, is that when it's acute, that might be a 1-year thing, but this is a 2 or 3 year process to actually get it done. So we'll suffer the pain, as we may have 2 years ago or so when Dan was leaving the chairmanship. It was very painful then. That was 2 years ago. Then it's sort of like isn't so bad for a couple of years, and so we put it down, and then we might have another painful year 2 or 3 years from now, and we won't have done anything. That's sort of the problem.
Well, and I'm going to speak for Carlisle for a minute, though, just because I don't think that's a shared perspective at the moment. And I think we might want to get back on track, because this could become a whole nother conversation.
But point well taken, Dean.
Yeah, of course.
Thanks. I'm going to black my screen for a little while. I'll be listening and chipping in if necessary. Thanks.
Thank you.
And now could be good timing for this financial impact of enrollment shifts here that I'll talk about. So it's important to understand the impact enrollment increases and decreases have on the assessments. Between October 2018 and October 2019, Concord gained 17 students and Carlisle lost 8. Total enrollment percentages went from 25.25% in Concord and 24.75% in Carlisle to 7.1% in Concord and 23.9% in Carlisle. This 0.85% swing resulted in an assessment increase to Concord of just under $273,000 in the FY21 budget. Further, as projected, the October 1 enrollment continued with 38 more Concord students and another 8 less in Carlisle. This will result in another 1.22% assessment swing to Concord and an assessment impact of $426,646 to Concord in the FY22 budget.
And that's a trend that might continue, might be roughly the same a couple of years out.
A couple more years,
or internals.
Yep.
Okay.
I think three more years we become somewhat stable.
Thank you.
So the Chapter 70 program is the major program of state aid to public elementary and secondary schools. in addition to providing state aid to support school operations. It also establishes minimum spending requirements for each school district and minimum requirements for each municipality's share of school costs. This link right here will get you a lot more Chapter 70 information that I could ever provide. Annually, the Commissioner of Revenue must provide cherry sheet estimates, which are best estimates for the amount of state aid and assessments at the time. Board of Assessors are required to use these estimates in determining their local budgets. Municipal revenue growth factors are a component used by DESE in determining the annual allocation of Chapter 70 aid in the cherry sheet program. You can go into this link to review the current governor's budget assessment as well as prior years. New grant opportunities are posted every day. You can follow this link and see our allocations and new grants that are available. A revolving fund separately accounts for specific revenues and earmarks them for expenditures for the particular purposes in which the revenue was generated from. The link shows the type of revolving accounts that we are allowed to have and then their purpose. The state circuit breaker program was started in 2004 to provide additional state funding to districts for high-cost special education students. The program provides additional funding when the educational costs of a special education student exceed a designated threshold that is well above the regular educational cost per student. The goal is to provide local school districts with additional state funding for high-cost special education students based on the actual costs of the individual student. The threshold for eligibility is tied to 4 times the state average foundation budget per pupil as calculated under state law. I believe the current per pupil costs for Concord and Carlisle are around, one is just under 11,000 and the other one is just over 11,000. So the threshold for eligibility, as I said, is tied to 4 times that cost, with the state paying 75% of the cost above that threshold. Circuit breaker reimbursements are for the district's prior year's expenses. For students attending private school education schools, the eligible cost for the reimbursement is based on the approved tuition rate set by the state's OSD or Operational Services Division. We also may receive gift and donations per MGL Chapter 44, Section 53A, and that is linked. And then student activities are part of every school district. We oversee the student activity managers at the high school and the middle school. Student activities are audited every year and reconciled every month. Linked is some information on student activities and the new agreed upon procedures, audit procedures. So backing up a little bit to how the circuit breaker works. So every year in our budget process, we estimate, and usually we have to estimate costs for that year for what we're going to get for next year's budget. So we usually try, and that's one of the last numbers that we calculate. So if our budget to the superintendent's budget is due to the school committee in mid-November, at the last second, we're finalizing what we think, really guessing what our circuit breaker numbers will be based on the actuals for that year. And then what we do is in the budget, I think it's better to be extremely transparent about the total costs of what our tuitions are. Many districts, if they say had $3 million in tuitions and they're getting $1 million in circuit breaker, they will just reduce the tuition amounts to the $2 million and not show any sort of offset. Same with our grants, such as an IDEA grant that we use for tuitions as well. We also have an offset in our budget. So whenever I submit a budget, the line items will have our anticipated total costs of the tuitions and then we have an offset. So you know what the real numbers are. Any questions on that? Because I know I get asked every single. Yes.
Yeah, Jared, this is Dee. The question I have on circuit breaker is it only tuition or is transportation costs also reimbursable?
Good question. So transportation costs are now, well, they were supposed to be. This will be the first year of eligible transportation costs. They had a formula of 25% to 50% to 75% to, I don't know, Laurie, did they go to 100? Did they talk about that?
Eventually they were going to go to 100. Yeah.
So that is something that they did have to cut in this budget process for FY21, which is, it's not a huge amount. It's not a huge amount, but so we will start budgeting for that transportation costs. So it would be, you know, 70 or 80,000. That's a guess per district, maybe a little bit more, a little bit less.
And Jared, last year, this time, we didn't count on that. So for us, it wasn't a cut. And of course, we rebuilt the budgets anyway, but it didn't feel like a cut because we hadn't assumed on the subsidy. And I think that'll be the safe place we go for until it's firmly in. I know the intent is to get the Student Opportunity Act back in line, but with COVID, it's just all slowed down. So.
Thank you.
Great. And just a real clarity on just the revolving account for circuit breaker. So every year you're allowed to have carryover in the revolving account for circuit breaker. You can carry over the full amount of what you received that year, but for the following year, you have to at least spend what you got that previous year. So if we got $1 million and we carried all of that over, that next year we would have to at least spend $1 million out of the circuit breaker. If we got 1.2 that next fiscal year, we could roll it over with 1.2 million in it, but we could not have, say, 2.2 million as a rollover.
Okay. And Jared, so how is it that you would get an excess if you're always a year behind, right? They're funding you with a year lag, right? So you're out of pocket the first year and you recover the next year. So how is it that you would get a reserve? Is it because costs are dropping all of a sudden?
Well, you sort of, so if we have a new tuition and say it's $100,000, that first year we're paying all of that $100,000. But all of the previous tuitions in prior years that children are, from, K and up, we are getting that relief. So we are getting relief on previous tuitions, but we're also creating a lot of programs in the district, and a lot of our kids are staying in district than they otherwise would have gone out. So our tuitions really under this new special ed director, if you look at the line items, they've gone down, and our tuition, our numbers have gone down. I'm like by, 20, give or take. So that's how you build it.
Right. So when you all of a sudden you have a decline, then the money that's coming in is greater than the money you're spending, and that ends up with a reserve.
Correct.
Okay. And that's kind of where we've been most recently. Is that correct?
Correct. And we have in past years prepaid for tuitions. So at the end of the fiscal year, so I budget for it, but at the end of the fiscal year, if we're able to have some excess, we can prepay. And then what we can do is we can reclassify expenses that are in our general fund for tuitions out of reclassify the ones that we have charged to the circuit breaker revolving account at the end of the year back to the general fund if we have excess room in there, and therefore that would bring our circuit breaker number up.
Thank you.
Great. Excellent.
Jared, on circuit breaker, you mentioned the 75%. Is that the de facto amount, or is that the amount in the legislation, but it then is impacted by available funds on Beacon Hill.
Correct. So in fact, that number is high right now, which is good. I think it's even closer to 80% right now. In the FY21 budget, I think I budgeted about 68 to 69% to call it safe. There's no exact, there's nothing in the legislator that says we have to pay this amount. If you remember from 2000 and I want to say the 2008, 2009 recession, they actually reduced circuit breaker to 40%, give or take. Now, what they did do is they gave stimulus money that offset that, because if they were to do that again, some districts, and drop them, 40%, that is an astronomical cost with no sort of offset.
Yeah, thank you.
And I will say that our special ed department does do an excellent job on their circuit breaker projections, because that's something that I watch them do, but I don't do it. So I'm really relying on them, and my 3 budgets have all come in fairly close.
And in order to do that, so they're basing their budget number for you based on current actuals, because that's what you're going to get in the next year, right?
Correct.
Okay.
Yeah.
There's a lot of rules to it too, a lot of eligibility and exempt, what's exempt, what's allowed. So that's why we trust special ed owns all of that and knows all the ins and outs and the changes.
Great. All right.
Could I just ask one quick question?
Please.
Jared, when do we know what those levels are? What's the time frame when those numbers are released from the state?
Yeah.
And where does this fall in terms of budget planning?
So they don't give it to us soon enough. So they actually adjust it too throughout the year. So cherry sheets, while I do use the cherry sheets, they're based on prior years, and oftentimes they change. And then the fourth quarter, they make those adjustments. I would say I'm pretty comfortable right now with the current numbers that we're seeing. Ian, when would you say you're saying, okay, this number's not changing?
So when the governor's budget comes out, usually you get a pretty good idea then. But for things like circuit breaker and for transportation reimbursement, you actually don't know the exact reimbursement amount until June. But they'll tell you pretty close what it's going to be. You'll know usually by February. This past year, everything was a little bit slower, obviously, because of the COVID. But for those 2 numbers, we won't know exactly what it is till June, till the year's over, is when we know for sure what we're getting. But usually by February, you have a really good idea of what it's going to be, just based on the governor's budget or the House budget process at that point.
Yeah. And I mean, I have had, not in Concord, I have had directors come to me before or after they got audited, and they had their final number and said that they were about $100,000 over than what we're actually getting due to a mistake or a change or something. So that's never a fun conversation with me.
I think all this fluidity is why you want some reserves. So you've got some backup if things don't go the way you expect or the percentages shift on you, all of that kind of thing.
Great. Okay.
So Jared, I'll note, it looks like we're doing well for time so far.
Perfect. I got a few slides left, all the boring stuff now. So regional agreements. So just talking a little bit about what is a regional agreement and what has to be in a regional agreement. So there are a number of steps required to form a regional school district. First, you need to name for the regional school district. Second, you need the members. You have to identify the members, cities and towns. Then you have to identify what type of regional. Is it going to be an academic one, or is it going to be a vocational? And then the grade range. Next is the governance. how many members on the school committee, how many from each town, what's the method of selecting those members, and what is the weight of their votes. Then school buildings need to be identified and in which towns they are located in. Next, the agreement will need a detailed procedure for the preparation and adoption of the annual budget. This includes budget hearing language, budget approval language, assessment methods and assessment due dates. It also includes the method by which the school transportation shall be provided. Regional districts can incur debt. There must be a method that it documents. A little side note, just for some of the new members or ones that were here in the past that don't know that we're now off the Moody's watch list. They reaffirmed our AAA rating. So we have a Moody's call every 2 years. And 2 years ago, we were on their watch list, and great news, we are now off it. Just wanted to point that out. There must be
Jared, the fact that we were on it was not indicative of any significant internal management issues. In fact, this was in regard to OPEB, was it not?
It was in regards to E&D.
And the E&D, and it really didn't set us apart from other districts, but now we're in very good standing, and unlike many other districts in that regard. Yeah.
Yep.
Okay. So it was E&D more than OPEB.
Correct. We thought OPEB would have had more favorable weight, and it didn't. They really looked at the reserves. That's what they cared about. So we had
the liquid reserves is what they wanted, not the stashed away for future issues. So.
Right.
Yeah.
Thank you. So and well done taking care of that. If you don't mind, a kudo right now.
Yeah. It's everybody. Yeah.
Yep.
And the last couple steps are just you need a method by which it can be reopened and amended. And then lastly, agreements and amendments must be approved by the Commissioner of Education. Great. All right.
Our regional agreement, I believe, goes back to 1969, does it? I think so.
I meant to pull it open and have it available, but that does sound right.
No problem. I think that's what it is.
Yeah. So E&D, or excess and deficiency. Currently, we are projecting, this is really good news, our E&D to be certified just under the 5% cap. We think we're going to be just about 4.99%. E&D may be used to support the regional budget. It may be credited to each town's minimum local contribution requirement. It may be used to support amounts in excess of the regional's net school spending requirement. It may be used on capital or transportation costs. It must be apportioned to the member towns in accordance with the terms of the regional agreement. And E&D funds may be expended only if funds from this source have been included in the original or amended budget. So that means if right now, we use E&D as a revenue source. So technically if we went over, God forbid, we would be covered because we do use E&D as a revenue source. If we did not use E&D as a revenue source, and on June 30th, I came to you and say, hey, we're going to be over. I'll be looking for another job, but we're going to be over. We would have to call a meeting or that night or somehow to amend the budget by June 30th, or we cannot use those funds. So you have to have a voted in E&D to use that fund. On July 1st, even if I'm saying we're at 5%, that literally disappears, and you have no E&D until you're certified by the DOR. Any questions on that? And like I said, they certify us. It's hard to get it in over the summer, because if you don't get it in by mid-August or late August, they're not going to get to it until after they set the local tax revenue, the local tax rates. So that's why we usually do not get our E&D certified until after our budget process or after the school committee vote.
Jared, I have a question. This is Mary. You mentioned earlier that we were on Moody's watch list because of E&D, right? How low can this go before that would trigger another?
Correct. So when we had the call, I believe our E&D was around either 2.1 or 2.7%. I want to say it was closer to 2.1. But in addition to having only a 2.1%. So the way that works, just when I say that, it's 2.1% of the budget. That is the maximum amount you can have in the E&D account. So we had 2.1 in there, but we also had reserves amount to fund the budget. So they looked at that as a negative because you're using what you have to also offset budget and assessments. But the other thing is we did not have good reserves. We didn't have great circuit breaker. And that is really our big one. And we really don't have any other stabilization accounts. We don't have a transportation stabilization account. We don't have a capital stabilization account. So when they brought all the numbers together, we only had 2.1 in E&D. We had outstanding debt, even though we said we just built a new building. Debt is actually going down, but we had no other reserves. So now we had our call with them last spring. We were projecting our E&D at roughly 4.9%. We were projecting having a full circuit breaker amount to be carried over. And we were in great shape.
So Jared, that was interesting. I didn't understand that if you don't budget to use some of E&D, you can't use it.
Or you can just amend the budget and increase it. So say I had a $35 million budget and it's June 20th and I'm saying we need $500,000. The school committee would then increase the budget by $500,000. We would have to give the towns notice because they can either fund it themselves through their budget or they can say, no, you have enough in your E&D, go ahead and increase your budget. And
okay.
So that's how that works.
Is it accurate to say then, Jared, that we earmark it when we adopt the budget, and then subsequent to that, it's confirmed by the state as to the exact amount? Do I have that right or no?
No.
One of my goals is to eventually get E&D out as a revenue source. So I might eventually recommend, well, we did lower it. When I first came in, it was at $700,000. Now it's at $300,000, which also Moody's looked favorably upon. But it's just not great practice to have E&D as a revenue source. So while that might be good practice that we wouldn't have to go back and amend the budget and call for a vote, I'd actually prefer to come to you with no E&D as a revenue source and say, in March, it looks like due to this tuition, we could possibly go over. And it's a safety net.
So
I don't know if you agree with that philosophy, Laurie, but I think you might.
I know, I do. Yeah, my first year, we hit 689,000 in revenue coming from E&D. And, to be drawing that much out of E&D, we were simply drawing out faster than we were putting in. And so E&D was dropping. We had burnt through the circuit breaker, any circuit breaker balance. So Jared's first year, he walked into E&D at about 2%, like he said, with a draw of $700,000 that he had to address in that very first budget he built and get that down. and we had to restore some circuit breaker. And that's why Moody's was, sort of flagging like this pattern is going to be a big problem if it doesn't correct it, if we don't get it corrected. So we've certainly corrected it and turned those gears. We both would like to see nothing coming out of E&D to fund the regular budget. At the moment, because of all the COVID savings last year, there's no urgency to that right this minute because E&D is at almost 5%. Again, I think we said to you back as we built that budget, that's all because we want some reserves as we get into FY22 and 23. And we have those now. So at some point, I think that's the goal, is that you're not using it's really almost a prepay in a way when you think about it. We're really using the money we saved last year to fund for next year because we put it in E&D and then we take it out. And the good news is we're putting more in than we're taking out now. But we'd love to wean off of that all the way over the next few years. I think you'll see us chip away at it in the next budgets. We don't have to be as dramatic. We cut it in half that first budget Jared built, which was a pretty big feat. So,
Jared, one question on revolving funds and E&D. I'm just wondering if there's a revolving fund that has a deficiency, how do you cover that?
So that actually at the region, if we have, take for example, a food service account, we're fortunate to run in the green, I'm sorry, the black. I always get those two confused. We're fortunate to run in the black. If a district runs in the negative, that amount is offset by contingency, E&D at the end of the year. They take that negative amount and you have to fund it. So it goes to zero.
Okay.
You can't take it from like athletics so say all of your revolving accounts add up to a positive, but then you have one negative account. Those do not offset that one negative account.
Okay. Is E&D the only source that you use to cover a deficiency?
We have not had one. But that would be. Now, if Concord, I've run into this in another district. If Concord, say, ran a negative food service revolving account, that would go off, I want to say, the free cash of the town.
Oh.
Yeah, and I'll have Kerry confirm that. That had been a big issue in one of my previous districts.
Okay.
Yeah, I can confirm that. Yeah, that's exactly how it works. It's the same as free cash and E&D. If you have a deficit on the town side, they'll dock your free cash amount by that amount to make sure.
So there's no E&D account at the CPS?
No, because we're just a town department.
Right.
Okay.
So the only place with that reserve is at the high school.
Okay.
Yeah. Great. Okay, so next is OPEB, a little bit about OPEB. So according to guidance from Governmental Accounting Standards Board, also known as GASB, OPEB is part of the compensation that employees earn each year, even though the benefits are not received until after employment has ended. Therefore, the cost of these future benefits is part of the cost of providing public services today in real time. Because employers and plan sponsors were not accurately calculating and disclosing unfunded liabilities associated with providing OPEB benefits, GASB issued statements 43 and 45 requiring disclosure of OPEB costs and liabilities. Municipalities, school districts, and collaboratives are not required to provide OPEB benefits. Municipalities that choose to offer OPEB benefits are not required to establish a trust fund to reduce the unfunded liability. Instead, what they do is they pay as you go, and many districts do that. If, however, a municipality chooses to establish such a trust fund, it must follow certain rules. The fund is an expendable trust fund subject to appropriation that is managed by a trustee or board of trustees. The assets of the trust are held solely to meet the current and future liabilities of the governmental unit for the group health insurance benefits for retirees and the dependents. All monies in the OPEB fund must be accounted for separately from other funds of the governmental unit and are not subject to claims of any general creditor of the governmental unit. As of June 30th, the region has just under 5.3 million in the fund. And then for more information on OPEB, you can see the informational guideline released by the Division of Local Services. So one of the things that we do is every year in our general fund budget, we fund our OPEB liability, about $550,000. So that money goes over into that fund, accrues interest, etc. We can use that OPEB money to fund health insurance or retiree health insurance in the general fund budget if we do run into some sort of deficit. I wouldn't recommend that unless it's an absolute last resort, but that's what we can use that money for. I believe we'll be fully, we'll meet our liability the same year as the high school debt comes off, and that's in 2030. And they keep changing, and I'll talk about this more when I present the budget. They no longer use the ARC, so it's very confusing. But the amount that we are currently putting into our general fund is potentially going to go down a little bit based on the new way that that they're doing the numbers. Not drastically, but it could be, we could be right at the ARC when before we weren't fully funding the ARC to now potentially being right there or a little bit above. And there's no reason why you can't pay more than your liability, but the goal is to be right at the sweet spot. And Ian, anything I may have missed or you want to add?
No, I don't think so. I think it's just the only thing to add is that as far as regional school districts or towns goes, the region and the town of Concord are both in great shape with OPEB compared to other districts in the Commonwealth. So.
I want to say we have the highest, if not one of the highest OPEB balances for any region in the state.
Yeah, we're close if we're not the highest. We're very close.
Yeah.
And rather than sing our praises only, I think we should note that this puts the other entities into some jeopardy, which is unfortunate.
Yeah. Very good. All right, so here are some just municipal finance law links. Again, if you're feeling tired and want to go to sleep, start reading these. So school districts are required to have a CPO or a chief procurement officer who is Mass MCPPO certified. We must follow all Chapter B procurement laws for all supplies, services, and real property. This is the link, Chapter 30B right here. If you want to learn about everything municipal government, Chapter 39 will take you down that hole. Chapter 44 is everything municipal finance. Chapter 66 is public records information. The intent of Chapter 70, again, is to assure fair and adequate minimum per student funding for public schools in the Commonwealth by defining a foundation budget and a standard of local funding effort applicable to every city and town in the Commonwealth. The calculation is very complicated because there are so many factors, but this link will give you the breakdown. Chapter 71 is the MGL on regional schools. Chapter 47 is information on athletic programs, school organizations, student activity accounts. Section 16 discusses regional schools and regional school district transportation reimbursement. Chapter 70B is MSBA, School Building Authority. Chapter 150E is Public Employee Labor Relations. Attached is a 200-page guide to collective bargaining law to the school committee members that will be helping me bargain the 7 contracts. So get in it and give me a summary of that. It will come in handy. And Chapter 268 is the conduct of public officials. And lastly, Chapter 149 is independent contractor rules. So then I just have, and I'm not even going to go into all of these, just an appendices of definitions. Oftentimes you'll hear me say many of these terms, and I just want to have really a growing glossary of definitions. We do include this actually in our budget books. So here is just some of the definitions. Again, I won't go into it, but if there is something that you want to learn more about, or you think I have left something out, please let me know, and I will add that. And then the last thing is another resource that I use, especially the second one, but the first one is the Guide to Financial Management for Town Officials. Again, it gives everyone's role, from the superintendent to the finance committee, to the assessors, to the treasurer, to the select board, what their roles are when it comes to town finance. And it's a really great document. And then the last one is the Mass Association of Regional Schools Regional Handbook and Guidebook. It was written, it should be updated, but it was written, I want to say, in 2012. And it was my Bible for the first couple of years. It was written by business managers and by Chris Lynch, who was and she's still at DESE, but in charge of the regional division. It's so much different than a regular K through 8. And it just breaks it down in a way that I understand. So, and that is it for my little tutorial here. And I welcome any more questions.
Jared, thank you.
Thank you, Jared. And to follow up a little bit on all of Jared's links, also MASC. I think some of you are familiar with charting the course and the resources that are there that can give additional information on that. Well, thanks, Jared. And
Jared.
And I'll have this posted tomorrow. And again, if you have any questions, please feel free to email me. Any suggestions, I'm happy to update this. And it might be something that I give every year or two.
And Jared, where will it live?
I'm working on the finance page on our website. It's going to be under the finance page. And I'm going to make it very visible. So once I do set it up, I'll actually send the link to the chairs here and they can send those out to everybody.
Great.
Thank you. That's a wonderful resource going forward. So now I think we can welcome Christine Reynolds, Vice Chair from the Concord Finance Committee. Christine, thank you so much for preparing this presentation for us.
Okay, so can I have a time check? So it's almost 7, so I can do this pretty quickly. Is that what we want to do?
Why don't we do a check-in in 15 or 20 minutes and see how we're doing?
Okay, I think I can do it pretty quickly.
And do you want to screen share, or
yeah, hold on, let me see if I can do that.
We'll need to have somebody open up that capacity for you.
Should be all set. No, go ahead,
good.
Christine. I think you're all set.
So if I'm in my PowerPoint, and if I hit share, let's see what happens.
You'll hit share and then you'll click the PowerPoint that you see.
Yeah.
You have to hit share in the Zoom.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking. So let me
Screen share is at the bottom of the toolbar.
Right. Okay, so let's see if that works. Nope. Let's see. If it's open on,
So if you do the screen share in Zoom, and then you'll click on your own desktop to hit the PowerPoint that you have.
okay, so let's see. Nope. Okay, so I have it. I've shared in. Let's see. I apologize. I don't know how to do it. Do you have it?
We do have a backup.
Can you just bring it up?
Yeah, sure. So let's see, and then you just cue us along here.
Yeah, I can do it. Yeah.
Okay. So let's see, where to go here. Bear with me.
I have a Court.
All right, I'm going to give it to you. I'm seeing it, but you're going to beat me to it.
You got it. Nope.
No, that's Jared's.
That's Jared's.
All right, so I'm going to open hers up. Good. Now I'm going to do my screen share. I think I got it here.
Okay.
And then we're going to find this.
Perfect.
And we're going to play from the start. Okay, all yours, Christine. Sorry about that.
Okay, terrific. Okay, so this is the process. So this is a process document to really talk about how we create the guidelines. So what are the guidelines? So the Finance Committee, one of our responsibilities is to create guidelines for the budget units for what they can spend for the coming year. So that's really what it's meant to be. It's a guideline to the three budget units, the Concord Public Schools, the Regional High School, and the town for not all of their expenses. There's a subset that we call the guideline expenses. So that's what this process is mainly about. Mm-hmm. And I want to distinguish that the guideline that we publish, we have two shots at it. We do a preliminary and then we do a final. So the preliminary will come out at the end of January and the final will come out at the end of February. And in between, there's lots of discussion, which those of you who participated in the process will be familiar with, and I'll take you through that. But the guideline is what we come forward with to say, here's the amount we think you can spend compared to the prior year. So typically it's an increase. It would show a percentage and a dollar amount. The subset or the difference that we have, or the item I want to draw your attention to, is we also have something that the Finance Committee came up with, I think it's 2 years ago now, called the Sustainable Growth Rate. So the sustainable growth rate is different from the guidelines, but it does inform the guidelines, and I'll explain to you how that works, but they are distinct. So I think there's been some confusion about that. So the guideline is what we publish on an annual basis to say, this is what we think we recommend the spend should be in the current year or in the budget we're preparing for. The sustainable growth rate is something that informs that guideline. Okay? All right, so if you can, any questions on that? Okay, so let's go to the first page then. So where we start is we pull together information. So some of this is art, some of it's science, right? So we have some estimates here. We also have some judgment calls that we're making. So what we're trying to come up with is what the implications are for spending to the town's property tax rate. So we come up with what we think the non-property tax revenue projections are going to be. So one of the things we have to kind of winnow down is, what do we have that's not driven by property tax? So we start out with those items, which include state aid, enterprise payments. So the enterprise units are the power and light plant, the water and sewer facilities. So there are actually payments into the town from those entities. So we think about that revenue, and also local receipts, which would be the excise tax on cars. It would be sales tax, hotel tax, meal tax. So we get estimates from the town on what those non-property tax revenues are going to be. So that's one one of the inputs that we gather. And in particular, for FY22, one of the things we're interested in is what the implications of COVID are on both state aid as well as those local receipts. So that's something we'll be thinking about this year. So that's number one. Number two is non-guideline expenses. So what we're providing guidelines on is what I will call our operating expenses to the business units. There are things that we call fixed expenses, which are outside of our guidelines. So meaning that the town sort of says these items are non-discretionary, they are going to be covered by the combination of property tax and non-property tax revenues. So those items are the town OPEB, which is separate from the OPEB we just talked about at the high school. So the town OPEB, which includes Concord Public Schools OPEB, pension costs, health insurance, the Minuteman assessment. So the Minuteman Regional High School assesses Concord an amount every year, and debt service. So essentially, we take those costs kind of off the top, and they're outside of what we recommend for a guideline change. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. The next thing we look at is how much tax we can raise, right? So we've looked at our non-property tax revenue. We've looked at the fixed expenses that we need to cover. And now we're looking at how much property tax can we raise. So the first thing that we do is Carrie works through with us what we can actually raise under Prop 2.5. So without going to an override vote at the town, how much can we levy? And it's a calculation. It's a fairly simple calculation. It looks at your last year's property tax, adds 2.5%, and then adds any excluded amounts. So in Concord, we can vote to exclude debt service payments. So you add those on top. So you come out with a gross amount of, here's the maximum amount you can raise before going to an override vote. So we need to know that number. So that gives us a sense of what we can raise from property tax. Traditionally, within Concord, we have not raised 100% of that amount. So we have what we call levy capacity. We retain 4 to 5% of that maximum amount, meaning we don't tax up to the cap under 2.5. And we do that to give ourselves flexibility. To the extent that we got surprised and we needed to at some point, we'd have a little bit of room. So it's about 4 to 5%, which is somewhere around $4 to $4.5 million. Any questions on that? Okay. And then we look at where else can we draw revenue from. So as we just talked about on E&D, so the high school has the opportunity to potentially use some of its reserves. Similarly, in the town, there's something called free cash, which is at the end of each budget year, the amount of excess revenue over expenses. So we typically have an amount that we add to E&D somewhere around $1 million. That's not where we are today because of COVID, but that's about what it's been. And we, in our tax rate, assume $1 million offset out of free cash. So we use about $1 million of free cash we have for the past couple of years to offset property taxes that would otherwise be levied. So that's another source that we have. And then if there are any potential expense offsets, so typically we don't have those, but with COVID, we did have it in the most recent budget that we prepared because there were some expense offsets that were provided by the feds for COVID-related expenses. So we may have that in FY22, we may not. So that's also a consideration that we would have. So if you can go to the next page. Okay. So we have all this information, and then we pull it all together, and we have, now we want to know what the 3 budget units need in terms of spending. So we get 2 bites at that apple. So we sent out an information request letter at the end of July that lays out for the 3 budget units information that the Finance Committee would like to have to help us consider what the needs are. those are provided to us this year. We'll get them in connection with some meetings in January. So we ask for, information on prior year budgets and actuals. We ask for information on enrollment, any changes in services or projected spending. So and at the high school, we also we'll ask for information on what you project state aid to be what you think your OPEB funding will be, and so forth. And obviously, as we also need to know enrollment, because that changes the assessment on the high school. So we get information from the schools and the towns in terms of where they are currently in terms of their budgets. That gives us information, and then we meet again in February with the same groups to ask them for, okay, can you now give us your final request, if you will? Because in between our first meeting and our second meeting, we have issued what's known as our preliminary guideline. So we get a first round of information. We go back out to the 3 budget units and say, this is where we think the guideline's coming out. They come back and meet us several weeks later and say, here's how we can respond to that request in terms of a guideline or not. And so we have a dialogue around what the spending needs are for the upcoming budget year with the 3 units. So that's the dialogue that goes on there. What we're doing, so now in the second stage, so we've gathered information on spending, we've gathered information on revenue, we know what our fixed costs are, we know what our property tax levy is. Now we're getting together to model what the potential implications are. So we're looking at, depending upon where the budget units come in for requests, depending upon what we think our non-property tax revenue is, what the levy comes out to be, we model different scenarios, really trying to understand what the implications are for spending, as well as the impact on the taxpayer in the town. So we're looking at what's the impact on different scenarios to the tax bill. So we're usually looking at a median or an average tax bill in the town to say, if we have this amount of spending, if we have these assumptions on revenue, what happens to the tax bill? So we're looking at that to see we have a range of answers, essentially. You can go to the next page.
Christine, before you move on, in a normal year, phase 1 would be what? November, and phase 2 would be December?
We normally are done, let's see, we start in October for phase 1 normally, and then it would be by the end of November, we try to be done, or maybe I think early December is where we came out maybe 2 years ago, but technically we were supposed to be done by November 30th.
Okay, so we shouldn't be too comfortable about this schedule, because we're going to revert back to our normal at some point.
Yeah, presumably. Yep. Yeah, if town meeting goes back to an April date, we'd be back in that fall window. Okay, so now we have a series of modeled answers. So we have some ranges of what happens to tax bills depending upon levels of spending and revenue. And then we're looking at how do we determine the reasonableness. This is the art part of the discussion. So the committee is looking at the different results, and here's what we're thinking about. So one thing we're looking at, as I mentioned earlier, is the sustainable growth rate. So this is this concept that we came up with, I think it's two years ago now, where we started to say we would like to have a benchmark, if you will, for us to look at growth in the tax bill. And the benchmark that we chose is essentially a proxy for inflation. So that's what the sustainable growth rate ends up to be. So it's a calculated amount. We calculate it in the summer. So we calculate in July a rate that we include in that first request letter that goes out at the end of July, and it's an average. It's a mathematic average of CPI, so current CPI locally in New England, and a forward-looking rate, which is a 10-year Treasury bill yield. So we use those two, which the market would really view as their feel for future inflation. So we look at those two items, we give them a pure mathematic average, and the current one is less than 1%. It's 0.645. So that's one measure that we look at when we're comparing what the growth in the tax bill is. We look at what would an inflation measure be. So we look at that. We also look at, we can look at local unemployment. We can look at income statistics. We can look at peer communities, looking at average income, tax bill as a percent of average income. So we can have discussions around how does this feel? How reasonable does it look given current considerations? And this is really a dialogue with the committee, and it takes us a bit of time to go back and forth. But that's where the that's where we really come up with the guideline is in item 3. Any questions on that?
No, I think it's very clear. Thank you.
Yep. And I think I think that's the end. There's another page or not. Yeah. So then this is just the timing. So as I said, we have a preliminary guideline that'll be issued on January 21st. So that'll be after our first round of discussions, and then we'll come back, have a second round of discussions with the budget units, and issue a final. We're planning for February 26th. So we do iterate. So there can be a change between 4 and 5 because obviously the budget units are coming back to us and responding to the first preliminary guideline.
Mm-hmm.
So that's how it works.
Chris, thank you. That was a great job. The only thing I would add to the discussion about the sustainable growth rate is another one of the reasons why the Finance Committee publishes this is to give guidance around contract negotiations. Because it really is the baseline is what is the cost of living? What does the market think the cost of living is going to be over the next 10 years? And what has it been over the last year? So it's a really good benchmark for cost of living increases. And I think this year it's what point, Chris, is it?
It's less than 1%. It's 0.645, I think, right?
So,
and that's not too far off. If you looked at what Social Security COLA is for 2021, I think it's like 1.2%. So,
yeah.
We're in a low inflation environment, and that's
right. Right. So that was another reason.
Yeah. Any other questions on it?
Can you forward that to the rest of the committee, whoever has it?
I'll be happy to do that, Christine, if you want.
Sure.
Thank you.
Okay.
I just have one comment to make, and this when Chris was going through the use of free cash, the town uses free cash every year. We dip into free cash by $1 million to offset property tax increases, and hopefully the next year we replenish that because we spent less than we budgeted or other revenues are higher than we thought. And that's in contrast to what I heard you say earlier, which is your E&D at the region level. You'd rather not be dipping into it. Do I understand that? Did I understand you correctly?
Dipping into it as a revenue source.
Right. Which is exactly what we have been doing at the town level, which is dipping into it as an offset to property tax. So it's just the kind of we're having a little bit of an inconsistency there that's interesting to me right now. I don't know what to do with that. But
well, Mary, we are still dipping into it. We haven't fixed that yet. So right now it's consistent.
Okay. So it's what, 300,000 you're dipping into it?
350.
Okay.
I think the concern was that there was a trend toward over-reliance.
Ah, I see. Okay. Yeah, we're not over-relying on free cash at the town level. Don't worry.
And I think you have to remember, we're capped at 5%. So our total availability out of E&D is how much does that total, Jared?
1.7
million. Yeah. So it's a nice amount of money, but it's not a huge amount of money in terms of, 1 million from free cash. We only can total 1.7.
And Mary, doesn't Concord try to not go below 5%?
Yes. And we try to stay within 5 to 10%.
Right. And I know Mr. Legalvo kept a plus 10, I think it was.
It was.
And so we've been sort of trying to use up some of that in appropriate ways over the last.
Right. Well, last year we spent quite a bit, actually. we put $2 million in for the middle school. So free cash is coming down to something closer to 6%.
Yeah, it's lower.
But anyway, it's just.
Any other questions for the Concord Finance Committee?
We want to thank you for putting this together. This was very, very, very useful. Just as Jared's will be useful again. So will yours, Christine and Mary. Thank you.
Great.
No, thank you. This is a great idea. Always a pleasure to work with you.
And Jim and Melissa, I know that before this meeting, Carlisle Finance Committee did not feel that they had anything they felt they needed to present or to share, but I just wanted to see if.
Well, I mean,
come up.
The Concord Finance Committee's presentation was a little different than I thought it would be. We could comment on where we are also in planning for fiscal 22. And that is, we're kind of on roughly the same track as Concord. That is, this week, we're going to send out our annual budget letter to all town departments. Since we're not a town manager form of government, the Finance Committee deals with all of the departments directly. So we're sending it out to about 15 departments. In January, we will meet with all of them. We do long sessions on 2 days to meet with all of them. We'll send out our guideline letter in early February with the goal of a final guideline at the end of the month or beginning of March. So that's the rough timeline we're on. Obviously, like Concord, we're well behind what we would be normally. We only finalized our fiscal 21 budget on October 17th. So we gave ourselves a bit of a break. We at least don't expect to be able to stay on the calendar I just mentioned, because we think that we'll be impacted by the pandemic in multiple ways through the rest of this fiscal year, including at the state level, which none of us knows really how that will play out. But we're heading out to do it. For fiscal 21, we actually created 4 budgets over a period of 8 or 9 months, and we're prepared to do the same again this year if we have to. But with that aside, this year, the fiscal 21 budget was a 0 increase overall to fiscal 20. And we ended up with, our excess levy capacity at about 10%, which is just a consequence of not, asking the taxpayers for more. We do target between 10 and 12% per year for our liquid reserves, which is free cash plus our stabilization fund. And like Concord, we always spend some of it, mainly to bring it into that range and to pay for one-time expenditures, not for operating budget items. And right now, this year, we're about 11% in terms of liquid reserves. And again, I think just like Concord, there's a lot of unknowns that we're all thinking about. You have the usual things like negotiations, et cetera, but, what will be the impact of higher unemployment on, property tax revenues? For us, I think everybody in Concord knows we basically have no commerce. And so it's all residential property tax. Mm-hmm. So far, those collections have held up quite well. And we're doing fine in that way, but we don't have any, we don't get any significant growth year to year in residential properties, some, but nothing substantial, and of course, 0 commercial growth. So we're always within the kind of rock and hard place when we're trying to balance revenue and expenditures. But very quick summary, that's kind of where we are. Be glad to answer any questions, but I think overall we're not far off in timeline from where you are.
And Jim, I'll just add on I know the region's timeline for approving the budget and all that doesn't always line up exactly with our process, so we'll reach out and adjust for that.
Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you.
Well, the way you describe it, Jim, it's sobering because of the unknowns and the amount of work it entails as a result, but it's encouraging because you anticipate it all. So thank you for that.
Well, I think we felt the town was, in the same place as our committee was. It's not always true. If we have to go out and ask for a 5% property tax increase, that's not the case. But this year, I think everybody was kind of on the same page. A page on which not much is written. So, we're, but we appreciate being here tonight. We've learned, Jared's explanations of things were helpful even to someone like me who's been through many of these budgets. And also, I very much appreciate hearing about your budget process in the town of Concord.
Yes, I agree. This has been great. Thank you.
Well, thank you for coming, and thank you to everyone from the Concord Finance Committee for coming, and Lori and Jared and Ian. I think that, I think this has been great. We've gotten to know each other, to put some faces to names, and to hopefully come to some kind of understanding of the positions that need to be considered through the budget process, and that we have parallel work going on. I have the principals working with Lori, the Jared working with the school committee, with Lori, the different town finance committees, and for all of us to have a better understanding of where we are on our tracks, and to, I think, really to appreciate the work that the others are doing has been constructive. So I'm very happy. This was my first budget workshop, and
I would echo that. We have different roles and functions, but we all certainly come together in the interests of kids and teachers and families in our two towns. And I think we all knew throughout tonight's session that we were talking about money, but we were talking about money as a necessary resource for our K-12 population, where we're pretty proud of the job that's been done, and we want to continue to do it. And know there's financial tension required to achieve our objectives. The budget process will be very interesting for those of us who are brand new to it this year. So buckle up, and and the negotiations as well will be an interesting journey for everybody involved, I'm sure. We, as Jared mentioned, have 7 bargaining units that we'll be working with in Concord-Carlisle. On the town side of Concord, I don't know if there's a lot in play similarly with Carlisle, but we'll soon learn in the Mosquito and the Journal if we don't hear it directly at meetings with select boards. Are there other questions or comments before we finish up this piece?
No, thank you to everyone.
Sarah, you and I didn't discuss this, but I wonder if, in addition to questions going to Jared around finance, if people have feedback about the workshop itself and how it was put together, perhaps they could send them to you. If
that would be fantastic. Yep.
Okay, that'd be wonderful. Thank you.
Great. So thank you. And we do have one more agenda item to discuss, that is our on-site COVID testing. Anybody's welcome to stay around for this. School committee members, you must stay around for
no option, right?
So Lori, we are. Thank you. Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.
Christine, thank you.
Yeah.
Take care, all. Thank you, FinComs.
Lori,
thank you, Andrea.
When you're ready, we can.
All right.
Looking forward to that.
Ready? Let me just get screen sharing going. So, this isn't news to the school committee, but for anyone else who's tuning in to catch a COVID update from us, we'll share this splice of some of the work we've been doing. One of the greatest challenges, I'd say, of the last month has been testing availability. And there's multiple layers to this, and I've highlighted a few pieces here, and I'll just tell some stories, I think. What we're finding, because we're running very, very tight protocols, testing is required for anyone who's symptomatic in any way of COVID type of symptoms. So they must stay home and get tested before they can return. That's both children and staff. So we are very dependent on testing availability and the turnaround time of test results. That's both helping us to run a really strict, safe environment And it's helping, I think, to really just stress the importance of everyone following the same protocols. The secondary layer to that is more about close contacts and the struggles we may get into as we have also tightened up protocols that if anyone is a close contact, we now, since right before Thanksgiving, are not allowing staff or students back in if the close contact in the family is not tested first. So that's different. You've probably heard us talk about contacts of contacts not being quarantined, but we changed that. They are not quarantined, but we do want a negative test in the house before we bring back anyone who's been proximate to that close contact. So this is just extraordinarily cautious. It's working, and that's, I think, how we're getting through the spike that's happening right now, just this real buffer we're building around our schools. What that has meant, though, is that the dependency and availability of testing is contingent on the return of the kids and the staff in order to re-access the school in-person environment. So we have been finding people waiting, and this is all, it depends. Some people are able to get tests pretty reliably and easily. It all depends on who your provider is, your insurance company, your access to some of the safe sites the state has put up, and sometimes just luck, I'm quite convinced. But for others, it's become this extraordinary frustration. So we've seen days delay to get in to be tested, multiple days to get test results delayed. You can see I put 6 and 7 days. You can imagine our ability to feel effective when people are getting tested and results are coming back 6 days later, which is still happening. It happened yesterday. So in a benign environment, assuming people are negative with COVID, and I'll switch gears in a minute, but if we're assuming people are negative, what it does is create this extended absenteeism. So a teacher may have a sore throat on Sunday and they will miss the entire week of school. Has become a very common event for us. For a student, especially if you're the sibling who now has to stay home until your sibling who has some symptoms is tested, we're now seeing multiple layers of kids at home until the testing turnaround time is improved. And I think I'm sensing a greater frustration in parents when the healthy sibling is now stuck home as well. The bottom line to that is we're just sensing and managing this much more heightened anxiety and frustration over the last number of weeks. I just think it becomes the tipping point for people. It's not that it's the end all be all, it's that everything else has gone on and they're hitting the point where now they've at the mercy of something that none of us have an ability to manage or help manage. They aren't feeling in control. We are not feeling in control. And it's absolutely creating bigger challenges. I think I'd add to that, the more staff and kids are out, the more juggling we're doing with, sometimes teachers are teaching remotely more when they're stuck home like that. Sometimes kids are more remote when they're stuck home like that. And just this incredibly complex layer of option we have to keep creating to meet all these variables. This is added to it for sure. So we have an opportunity, with great thanks to my colleague at the Concord Fire Department, the chief. Concord Fire has been doing on-site COVID testing for the last while. And the chief heard me I meet every Monday morning with the Concord town leaders. And my story of woe a week and a half ago was just the angst of the testing and the stress it's putting on everyone, the nurses as front line to most of this, the principals as people get frustrated. Some of it bubbles up to me for sure. The fire chief had reached out to his vendor and asked if an option for schools to participate was there. It turns out the vendor, and I'll name the vendor in a minute, actually has expanded this one piece of their business. The rest of the business is providing emergency supplies to the emergency service workers and fire departments, et cetera. This one COVID piece of their business, they are opening up to those who set an institutional contract with them. And so what they offer in this contract is on-site testing with our nurses doing the testing and a courier service that collects the test and brings it to Broad Institute. You'll remember we've talked about Broad off and on for months. Broad is running out of MIT and Harvard and is a reliable 24-hour or better turnaround time. There's also a physical site in Cambridge where this company's offices are. They've set up a COVID opportunity there, same day appointments, 24-hour turnaround time. So a little more detail is involved in that. Let me talk on what we are asking for tonight now that we have this option. So we've got a vendor that will help service and supply us on site, get the tests to Broad. We get access to the technology that allows the nurses to enter the test, track the test, and get the results. Anything given in district, the results will go directly to the nurses, which, boy, that cuts off this whole middle layer of communication we've been managing. The negative results are directly emailed to the patient. It is set up so that any positive results require a human to call and talk that through with them, which we're actually grateful for. So we can just do that in a really the training involved for this on-site test, most of it's the technology training and the database training. Those of you who've had COVID tests, it's a nasal swab. It's the anterior one. It's not the big, deep one. It's the more simple one. Not a huge amount of training required there. We would be looking to do this only at the high school. Lisa Koski is our lead nurse. We gave her a position back as we reopened, lead nurse / COVID coordinator. And we've backfilled with a per diem nurse. We talked about this as we reopened, per diem nurse, to allow her to have that role and still have staffing in the school. So she's quite comfortable that these are very quick tests. It's not super time consuming. We would schedule it by appointment so they would have, control over when people are coming and how. There's actually an exit to the school, an entrance right off of the nurse's office. And I have a picture if you really want me to. I meant to put it in the slides and forgot. Right next to their isolation room. So they can literally scoot in that door, go right to the isolation room, get tested, and go right back out again without ever contacting any other parts of the building. So we are not jeopardizing anything in terms of our safety measures. Cost is $60 per test. What my suggestion and request is tonight is consideration of paying for the staff. For months, we've been talking about some level of staff testing that because they are in our schools, we would support that. We never really landed on it because we haven't had an affordable option. What it would do is allow us to make things much more efficient in their turnaround time to be back in classrooms. They're not spending a whole day trying to find a test site, driving to a test site. Most recently, they've been sitting for 3 and 4 hours at the stop the spread sites in the morning, trying to be sure they get in. I feel pretty strongly that with what we are asking them to do right now, that it's a fairly moderate cost. And I can talk on that in a minute. Jared and I have been running numbers. For students, and we would like to open this up to students, both at the on-site in the high school and in the Cambridge option. Families would pay for that unless they, state that they have a fiscal need, and we would certainly work with them. This does not mean any of these people have to use our option. They can still go to any of the other things that are in place. If they want their insurance provider to cover it, they've still got those options. If they want free, they still can go to Stop the Spread, and the state is saying they're going to be opening more of those. This would just be another piece. I've talked with a few families, and actually we did send a few people over the weekend just so we were sure we were confident in what this all was in Cambridge, at least. And the response, both from the couple of families I sent and the handful of staff, incredibly positive. There's parking right there next to where you go in. It's 10 minutes. You make the appointment ahead of time. One of them said they had gone early thinking they were going to wait in line. They actually wouldn't let them in because they were early. Like, you're literally going in at the time you say you're going to be there. They're open evenings. That was a surprise to me on Sunday night when someone needed a test and went on. I thought they were booking it for Monday, and they said, oh no, I got in tonight, and they had test results by dawn the next morning. So it just has kind of started to, even in that little bit of time with a handful of people, popped this enormous stressor for us. So last piece, just a little more detail. The vendor is Pro EMS. What I've learned in understanding better who they are a vendor that helps to be the supply chain to the emergency service departments on all things they might need. So they're the middleman, essentially. They started this COVID testing option. Obviously, first responders want quick testing turnarounds and control over that. And the fire department is doing it on site on an as-needed basis. But what it's done is made Broad available to us in a smaller scale way, which has not been an option we've found before. Pro EMS has opened this up so that other municipalities, they said they have a couple private schools, other institutions are starting to partner with them slowly, but testing availability is not at all an option, and it will always be controlled because they have control over how many contracts they put out. And I expect that will stay very reliable. Broad, we know, is capable of up to 100,000 tests a day. Even with the colleges using them extensively through this first semester, only twice did they go over that 100,000 a day. So this is a minor little drop in the bucket for them, what's actually happening out of here. I think I mentioned most of what else is here. What we would offer on site, just to be sure I'm clear, is symptomatic and close contacts. They would have to be vetted through the nurses. Some people may get turned down if they don't meet those two criteria, one or the other. But this Cambridge piece allows asymptomatic people or people we don't deem being close enough contacts or something like that. We can open that up to families at any point. We can also open that up to staff who aren't going to be ones we pay for. Staff we pay for can do it at either place. Those will come, very tightly vetted. We're not going to just open this up wide and send them all the code and let anybody go. It'll still have to be a screening process for those that we're going to pay for. But it feels like a really big game changer for us in terms of how we're managing the protocols we've put in place and the options for families. And I guess I'll end with the part, let's not forget when we're waiting on a test that could be positive. I've kind of mentioned the inconvenience part and the delays in getting people in classrooms. If we have close contacts and we're waiting on whether that person who's been in the school is positive, time is valuable, obviously. And so this would help us have a much more efficient way to get those results back and know if the case is going to impact the school or not. And, we're at 39 cases as of last night, not today. We haven't had any today, knock on my wood desk. So we've done a lot of this, and this would be a big difference. In terms of, let me stop screen sharing so I can see you all. In terms of numbers, we track all the staff we track everybody who's tested. You've seen those data points every week that I post them and brought them here. We're at about 1,000 people tested since school opened. But that's everybody. And we're not going to cover the kids at this point. So we'd be talking about staff. It's an average, depending on the week and what's going on. A really busy week, like last week, we had 25 to 30 people tested. A more typical week pre-Thanksgiving has been 15-ish. So I think if you go on the high end of that, you're looking about $1,500 a week. And we can do this in stages. I know that's been suggested. If you did $1,500 a week times the 2/3 of the year left, that's a $40,000 cost. And Jared can chime in a little bit here on terms of money. We've been able to offset some things that we thought the budget was going to have to cover through the CARES Act money. So we've got some funds available that wouldn't have been available without CARES Act. This is so CARES Act appropriate. It's just the timing is off because that's going to expire. And there may be more coming when the federal government gets this package through finally. But in the meantime, we've got some offsets available, certainly within this kind of price tag, to look at making this an option for staff. I I just feel strongly it feels like a very small thing to help them with what they're actually doing for kids. And, we talked on asymptomatic testing at large scales, and obviously we got stuck on how much that would cost. And that was the right decision. But this one, I feel like let's see if we can help take a little edge off for them. So that's where we are. I think we're looking for your feedback and, as appropriate, your endorsement of this. We'd love to get up and started and see if we could try to do the on-site piece with staff even before the break. The Cambridge piece is available immediately. Like I said, I started sending a few people there just to learn more about it. We did not send any staff that we paid for. Everybody's paid for themselves because I didn't have your endorsement of that. And then maybe be able to do on-site with the kids in January. So it feels, I don't know, the right place at the right time finally went our way. And this is collaboration with our town departments. And the other part I think that felt good to me is the fire departments had a very good experience and they're doing it all the time. So we're not charting our own course here. We're going into some familiar territory that the town's had success with.
Lori, have faculty or staff rendered any opinion?
Anecdotally and in small bits, absolutely, they're excited to have a more convenient, time-efficient option. There's no doubt about that. Even sending them to Cambridge has been incredibly well received, just to have something that easy to manage and plan for. You're not waiting in this line for unpredicted amounts. Would they love for us to pay for? Of course, they would find that beneficial. I actually, right now, the greater gratitude is finding something efficient. But I know they'll be appreciative if we're willing to cover costs too, especially if someone has to go multiple times, which we do have some people starting to do that because our protocols are so strict. This just would be beneficial. And yesterday we had teachers, that had close contact pieces from our school exposure.
Right.
I mean, we certainly, I think, should be considering paying for those. So
I've only got one more question now, and then I'll pipe down, and I've got more questions later. Close contact for us is still 15 minutes, 6 feet.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I think that when we went through a lot of conversation about testing, we knew it was important, but we didn't know how, or it was
Yeah.
right, or where, or through, what did we hope to achieve was always what is this going to give us, right?
Right.
Now we have identified the need, right? And we have identified a way that we can meet that need. So I think this is just fantastic for us. I just have a question. Is there a contract length to this, or is this do we sign up for some period of time?
I have the draft and I need to check that piece for you, but I believe it's a small notice we give them and we can undo all of this. And we have total control of whether people go or not, right? So even if the contract is in place, we can just stop sending people. So it's a pretty controlled environment here if something changes.
Okay. And then the close contacts, the on-site, I just want to clarify, the on-site close contacts are people who are close contacts identified from in-school close contacts.
Well,
right?
I would actually propose I propose that we offer testing to any close contacts, because any close contacts that are relational to the school, even if they weren't exposed at school, just because that information is incredibly important to us, because that means a school member has been exposed. What I suggest for paying for it is only probably the close contacts within the school.
Okay.
I'll echo the support so far. I've dealt with some testing myself so far, and can vouch for how complicated and time consuming it is. Like Sarah said, this is a need that we've defined in much more detail over the past couple of months, and I think it's critical that we're doing this. I would want to mention huge thanks to the fire chief for bringing this up based on your comments. I mean, that's talk about town collaboration, and also thanks to you for building those relationships and working so closely with everyone. So I'm in full support. I also just want to kind of mention and clarify for myself and anybody else, it sounds like the budgeting aspect of it is basically made easy because of the CARES Act. Although we can't put the CARES Act money towards it, it's because of that CARES Act that covered some other things that were then where money can be freed up to this, that we're able to do it. And is that a clear description of it?
Yep.
Yep. Okay, great.
Yeah.
So just hugely supportive. Thank you for making this happen.
And who knew? I mean, all the data we've been collecting informs all this so that we know we know what we've needed for testing. It's all very well documented. So I feel really informed going in as to what this will feel and look like, which is why we feel like the nurses can manage it and why we have a sense of cost. So that part, it was helpful to gather it. Now we're actually using the data, which is always a nice piece to see. Yeah.
It's always good when you can.
Yeah.
So Lori, I totally agree. I think this is like the definition of a measured response. Like it makes so much sense and it's really controlled. And my questions are, so at the site at the high school, when that's up and running, would students be able, in other buildings, not at the high school, be able to access that site, or would they go to Cambridge?
No, we would open it up, and that's a great question, and I should clarify both. We are talking about including Carlisle too. So we would just have a central testing site for all of the K-8 Concord schools, the high school, and K-8 Carlisle. We'd like to be a good sister school to them, all by appointment. And you have to meet the criteria of symptomatic or close contact to come to the high school and be tested right in town. If you don't meet that criteria, then we can refer people out to Cambridge and still have a really convenient option, but not bog our nurses in more than they can manage.
Right. I'm thinking of a scenario just because I feel like so many, as this has all become complicated and, parents are talking about how challenging this is. If in fact, let's say you have a close contact, my son, Harry, who just did this. If he were positive, I guess then my kids become close contacts. So of course, then they bomb into the system. Now, I know, for example, I know several families in town who have kids like in private school and public school and again, because families are paying, would the family in the district have access or just those enrolled?
Yeah.
And similarly too, now if my child is a close contact and is positive, can I use this if I pay or no? You know what I mean? Like I'm just thinking about how to explain this to families.
So the way we've talked about it is that the enrolled students would have access. The family members, though, can go to Cambridge at any point.
Okay.
So it could be that
referral.
If you want, just by being connected to us, the whole family can go to Cambridge. But I don't want to test the whole family at the high school.
Oh, no, right. Okay. But they would have access to the Cambridge lab. Great.
Yeah. Yes.
So Lori, who is the gatekeeper?
So for the paid pieces, I'm going to be working with the principals to be the gatekeeper on that.
Okay.
I need to talk more with the Cambridge, with EMS Pro in terms of, they right now are really very flexible. When I asked over the weekend, the answer was send us anybody connected to your institution. So what I want to ask them is how they're actually making sure that those are the people that come there. I know the teachers who went early said they were asked when they got there who they worked for, even if they were paying and going in through that route of paying their own. So we aren't going to post this on the webpage. We're not going to email it out to everybody. People are going to need to get the information through an as-needed basis through the nurses, principals, or central office. So, but I'm going to tighten up on the part we're going to pay for is going to be really Loctite. I'm going to be sure of that. The part about how much access we give to the community in terms of the piece in Cambridge, especially, I just want to talk with them more as to how they want to set that up more so we don't overwhelm the lab than anything else, or fill up their appointments.
And will we be paying for Carlisle staff?
No, we would not. Carlisle can if they'd like to. I don't know.
I understand. I just want to be sure that our numbers did or did not include. Okay, thank you.
No, Jared and I are going to keep track and even break out Concord in the region and make sure that all gets split the way it should.
So if I'm correct, the high school would not be available to a close contact that is not an enrolled student.
Correct.
And to be clear, a parent of a close contact would pay $60 to the region, and then we are responsible for payments to the vendor.
That's what we're expecting. I'm going to work with them tomorrow after I sign the contract. That, yeah,
and
that's what
we'll want to broadcast loud and clear that they're not going to expect us to do insurance billing. That's going to have to be rather clear.
Oh, no. In fact, when you go into Cambridge, it's very clear. They say, hand us, $60 up front, period. We would certainly be operating that same way out of the high school.
The place where I'm real murky on all of this, in spite of the fact that we're all learning epidemiology at a rapid rate, is if a person is a close contact, is there not an optimal time for the testing? Are they not both asymptomatic and going to test negative during an initial period of incubation? And are we going to address that?
Yeah, I can answer it. There's not one perfect answer, unfortunately. The optimal time is 4 to 8 days after exposure. The part I will say loud and clear is when we know someone's been exposed, that's a really long time for us to wait for test results, and very long for an anxious family to wait for test results. So Trish McGeehan, our public health nurse, has been going more towards the 4-day mark because it kind of hits the middle there.
Good.
And often what's been happening, by the time someone's been at school in symptomatic, by the time they get tested, we get a test result back, we're at day 5 anyway. It's been very rare that we know all of this really that early. So, but day 4 seems to be about right, where we try to maximize both sides of the balancing act here.
Good. Okay. And why is 40K the right number? Do we want to give you more license to stay on top of this as aggressively as this community is going to need to, perhaps?
Yeah, what I did was run with the numbers that I can see out of the history so far of how much testing's gone on with the staff, and just multiplied it times the 26 weeks left in the school year. 1,500 feels a little high, but not if we're staying at the case counts in the state like we've had. Certainly when case counts were low, we didn't have as many people needing to get tested. So I'd love to just check in with you maybe in a few months and see where we are with how this is actually playing out, and then we could review money at that point.
I don't suspect any of us are too concerned about this, but at some point you'll identify the line items from which you accrued CARES savings and offsets as you move money. Okay.
Yeah. In fact, Jared, that's probably part of you wrapping up the CARES Act deadline for the end of the month.
So what I hope to do is be able to is it January 5th, the first or second meeting, hopefully the first meeting in January, be able to give you the full tally of what we spent all the money on, including the monies we received from Concord. The reasons I don't have them updated now is Ian was out for a couple of weeks. So we're still working to do some reclassifications, but it's going to be really tight and easy to present to you all.
Great.
Yeah, Lori, I think you should check in with us in January to let us know how this is going.
Absolutely.
If it's underutilized or over, I have a feeling it's going to be well utilized, but maybe more on the paid end of things.
Yeah. Yep.
I think it's going to be very valuable to the overall health and safety of the community. So it's.
And help our staffing, I guess I can't understate the staffing struggles. We're making it work, but, I did one more example because I gave it to like 5 people this weekend. One staff member's daughter was a close contact, and we gave her this, and we expected she was going to miss at least 2 days of work waiting for her daughter's test to come back. Yeah. She actually got in Sunday afternoon. Test result was back 5:30 Monday morning, and she didn't miss 1 day of work. Like, that has not happened before. Right. So big difference.
So the kids would have had 2 days of a sub.
Yeah. Just waiting.
Yes.
Yeah, just waiting.
The budget would have had 2 days of a sub.
Well, we're not bringing subs in. Remember, as a district, we decided that, but what it does mean is we're pulling people from other things they're supposed to be doing, and the trickle down is real. No doubt about it, even if it's not $1, Sarah. Yeah.
Nice.
Yeah.
Yeah.
For anybody.
Yeah. Yeah.
Laurie, this is definitely the right time to bring more opportunities for testing and bring down the barrier to testing and for students and the faculty. Just manage our staff members just managing the teaching in pandemic with the schedules and just to throw another thing that they have to figure it out and waste time on standing in line is definitely not the correct way to the right way to spend the right use of their time and effort. So glad to see that come on board. I had a question in terms of screening. You mentioned that there will be a way to screen. Would it be a high school nurse asking the students those questions? What's the screening process to weed out, Yeah.
Yeah, good question. We're going to require that a parent be involved in all of this, even the high school kids who are right there and older. So we're going to ask them to call the high school nurse's office and speak to one of the nurses there and explain what's happening and why they'd like a test. And we want the parent in it right from the beginning for lots of reasons, obviously, including that just takes care of any permissions that we need and anything like that. So it'll be very hands-on, which is why it's got to stay a manageable number of people that are on site at the high school. And this lab in Cambridge just became this really nice tier 2 that we didn't even know was part of this until after the fact. So at least that way, when we turn people away at the high school, we've got a really great option if they want it. So, but direct contact with the nurses, Eva, is going to be the bottom line.
Oh, that's awesome. And another thing I wanted to bring up is if families wouldn't have the funds or they choose not to use the $60 cost of testing, they still would have, you still would be directing them, excuse me, Cameron, you would still be, sorry.
It's okay. We're glad
college student is back.
glad to hear he's home, Eva.
I'm happy. But they would still have the opportunity to do the free testing through, and there is a way to direct them. Yes. Because that confusion, throwing confusion and no direction as families are going through that process is just not right.
Yeah, absolutely. So, all those other options are still available. And it'll be choice of staff and families whether they use our options or not.
And if it's a student, Eva, they're going to have a fee waiver option where they'll meet some simple criteria.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
So I guess if you'll forgive me for stating the obvious, I'm hoping this will roll out with doubling down on our messages that this doesn't replace anything else.
No, it doesn't. Absolutely. Yeah.
Because that's how this blows up on us.
Yeah.
Is if this equates with relaxation anywhere else in the vigilance.
Right. Absolutely right.
So thank you for putting this together. Thanks to Chief Judge and Jared for confirming that the numbers are going to be sound. Do you need anything formal from us tonight? It looks like you don't.
I don't think so. So
You've got the authority.
consensus sounds
protest. Yeah.
great. And then we'll bring you updates regularly. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you. Thank you.
No, not a bit. Thank you. And, you know, you wouldn't have brought this before us in a public session if you weren't confident it was the right thing to do, because offering it up doesn't mean that pulling it back is a very good option at this point.
Yeah.
So thanks for doing the work to bring it to us with this level of confidence.
Yeah, thank you. And it may be one of the, you know, each of this whole thing's had phases to it. And then that we get a pressure point and we are able to turn a lever and get over the pressure point. This feels like one of the most important pressure points about how we're going to get through the rest of the year. And I don't know that, to Sarah's way of saying it, I wouldn't have known that in September, that people getting to testing was going to be a challenge and that it would, you know, get in the way so much. So you're right. We're so much more informed.
What are going to be the lines of communication available during the December recess?
Actually, I was talking with the leaders about that this morning. We're trying to find a balanced, we're trying to find a very streamlined way for people who need communication, but not to have a whole, you know, array of people on their phones 24/7. So this morning we were looking at creating one email that's covid@concordps.org. And then we figure out how one person a day or something like that owns that one email. And the rest of us get, if we're not on duty, you know, quote unquote, the rest of us are not engaged with our email and texts and phones and all of that.
Excellent.
So
Good. Okay.
I have to get it all in place, but I think that's the way we're going to go. We do need to be available. We certainly, at the beginning of the vacation, need to know if there's any positive cases that still trace back to school. And we'd like to be a resource to families. It's such a maze to navigate how all this works, but not all of us all week at all. We need to be off. So
good.
So that's the idea. We'll keep you posted.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. This is how I get excited now. Fixing the testing is pretty exciting right now. So.
Amazing what a Q-tip can do, isn't it?
Oh, it's amazing. It's all relative.
And that testing no longer refers to standardized testing with little circles to fill in, but disease testing.
And I think, aside from some of us at the district, I think Trish McGeehan's life will get enormously easier. The amount of time our public health nurse spends trying to weave between her database and information coming into her, and this will be so much more efficient. So thank you.
And I'll just say we're fortunate that you found a solution working with, but it is unfortunate that all these districts are going through this. It's just not right. So
agreed.
So yeah, thank you for bringing us a local solution, but I wish you didn't have to go through this.
It is emblematic of the patchwork that.
Yeah.
We won't.
Yeah, it really is that to think each district across the country is trying to figure some of this out by themselves is disappointing, to say the least.
Yeah.
So.
All right.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Quick look ahead next week. We meet at our appointed 5 or exec at 4:30. Do we know? Or we will know soon?
You'll know after tomorrow, I believe.
Fine. Okay. So does 4:30 work for people if necessary next Tuesday?
Yeah. Just remind us all.
I think actually, if that happens, I will not be able to make it at 4:30 because I have middle school parent teacher conferences until right before we start, until 4:50.
5 does work, Heather?
What?
5 does work?
5 I can do. I have parent teacher conferences back to back up until 5.
We'll do our best. We'll see what we can do.
Okay.
Okay.
All right. Thank you, everyone.
All right.
Thank you.
Oh, do we need a motion?
Well, it was a workshop, but we called a meeting for the workshop.
Yes. So I'll motion that both committees adjourn.
Second that for both.
Roll call.
Aye for both.
Booth, aye for both.
Out aye for both.
Aye for both.
Mustafi, aye for region.
Rainey, aye for both.
Wilson for region. Thank you.
Thank you. Have a good night.
The workshop was awesome. Thank you.